Hello, I'm Dylan.
And I'm Keon.
And this is Inevitable, that podcast where 4/5 of the episode is just last week's episode again, because this week we watched Serpent in the Circle.
Written by Jeremy Burnham and Trevor Ray.
Directed by Peter Graham Scott.
And aired on January 24th, 1977.
Everybody's favorite television pastime, an episode where we spend 5 minutes recapping the last episode, 15 minutes talking about the last episode, and 5 minutes introducing new stuff.
Yeah, I remember last week when we were talking about, this isn't as, devoid of content as, I remembered it being. And you're like, yeah, it's not as devoid of content as you said it would be. And then this episode hits you like a ton of bricks. Because there is new stuff, don't get me wrong. But there's a lot of old stuff as well.
To be fair to the show, I did try to pay attention to this episode and watch it.
Tried and failed.
I got so bored, literally 12 minutes in, I checked out of the episode.
Oh, well, I didn't get bored. I just heavily noticed how most of this was like a recap.
I just started taking notes on things that I thought were funny in every scene. So, most of my notes are just things that are funny. So, I guess that's indicative of how much attention I was paying.
There is some vital information in this episode that I want to go over, and that's going to contribute to the overall scheme of things. But I guess we can just start by saying that this episode starts with the last 5 minutes of the last episode just slapped right on top of this one. It's maybe not 5 minutes, it's maybe more like 3.
Yeah, it's only 3.
Yeah, but we get Matthew sort of running through the village again. He sees the satanic ritual again, or pagan ritual, I guess. Because we find out this is all pre-Christian stuff.
Right.
And then we get...
Matthew is at home.
Yeah, he wakes up at home.
And he thinks he sees Di in the window, and he just runs out into the dark. Looking for Di, I guess. But really, he just runs out into the dark. And
Well, Di seems to know what's going on here, or at least have a better clue than anyone else.
That's true, but you know what I realized later in this episode when he's talking to the kids at the school?
Is that he doesn't.
Is that, one, I don't know if he does, and two, he just seems like a really weird, creepy, crazy old man. And, if I was any of these people or any of the parents in this town, I'd be like, yo, stay away from that Di dude, because he's on some weird stuff. Looks like he's just on drugs. He's talking to the kids at the school. He's just leaning through the window, talking to the kids at the school,
want to come see the sanctuary?
Yeah, basically, want to come to sanctuary, how's no one weirded out by this? And Matthew's just sign me the heck up.
Like his best friend.
Matthew's Di is the coolest dude in this town. And if Di would ask me to go to sanctuary, I'm going to be there freaking next week.
The sad thing about this is that Di actually is the coolest one in town. I mean,
yeah, because everybody else is brainwashed. But if this was any normal town, Di would be everybody would be yo, you need to stay away from Di. If he comes up to you, you need to turn around and walk away because he's on some weird stuff.
But nope.
He's like the town homeless person that everybody looks away from when he walks down the street.
We find out in this episode that he lives in just a hole in the ground, essentially. But yeah, Matthew wakes up back at home the next morning, and there's a doctor there checking him out. We get some, as far as I remember, never touched on again, backstory for the doctor, which is that he, had a heart attack, and he relocated his practice to Millbury for some reason. And he thought he would see, more action out in the boondocks because he would be the only doctor in town, but no.
We get a lot of weird backstory in this episode from characters who you're why did we care?
And as far as I remember, none of this is ever touched on again. I guess it's just to add more flavor to the town.
Yeah, the weird butler guy is revealed to have a whole history that I'll get to in a bit.
I don't even remember this.
Anyway, we actually do see Matthew kind of trip or take a tumble, and then he wakes up and they're oh, we found you on the step. And Matthew's no way. That woman, the person making our food, she was at this weird ritual, and she saw me pass out in the field, Dad. And he's well, you might be right, Matthew, and I can't prove you wrong, so, I'm going to keep my eye out.
Yeah, so Crabtree is definitely suspicious.
Right. And
So Matthew goes to school like everything's normal.
wait. Did you? Okay. Okay, so Adam's eating breakfast.
Right.
Di looks through the window.
Right.
Adam and Di have a conversation. Di runs off. Matthew comes down. He's like, that was Di. And Adam's like, seems like a pretty weird guy. Anyway, Crabtree comes in. Did you notice this? So Adam asks Matthew, like, oh, do you want some breakfast? And Matthew's like, yeah. So Adam turns to Mrs. Crabtree and goes, one invalid breakfast, please.
Right. Yeah, I noticed that.
Why?
Because Matthew was, like, supposedly sick.
Why? Why do you need to be called an invalid? Looks fine to me.
Yeah, he seems fine, but I guess Adam was just under the impression that he was sick and not in the condition to eat a non-invalid breakfast.
So that
But he's fine because he goes to school.
right, and this is when Di pops in the window.
Well, we get the scene where
For the
like
first
he's
time.
being like the four non-happy kids are like in detention or something, and they're doing extra work. And the girl from last week who was like the daughter of the farmer has finally converted over, and she's able to do the like really hard math problem or whatever. Mm-hmm. And then Sandra, Matthew, and whatever the other kid's name is are like, hey, we're in this together. We're the only three left. And they're like, they come up with like a plan, like we should call each other like every day and make sure like nothing weird is happening or something.
Yeah, they give him this math problem to do, and it's or to prove it's that 1 equals 1 over pi integral from negative infinity to infinity of sine x over x dx.
Jesus.
And he's like, oh yeah, it's just like a version of the Helmholtz transform or something. And I'm like, all right, they clearly just wrote this to be like the most complicated way to solve this integral, because you can solve this integral pretty easily without using all that nonsense. Just
Again, like with the quality of these episodes, I'm surprised you can even see like what's on the board and what's on the map and stuff like that. But unless you're using another source, then I am, but I don't think you are. Anyway, this is when they go out in the hall and Di, again, I guess his pastime is just popping his head through windows and being really creepy.
at a school.
And Adam is like, hey, it's my buddy Di.
You mean Matthew.
I mean Matthew. Yeah, my bad. And Di's like, so you three are basically the only ones in town who aren't, like, brainwashed. But if you ever need help, come to my sanctuary.
It's pretty weird. This is weird.
Come to my white van, parked right outside the village.
Adam is like talking with the museum
Margaret.
curator, Margaret.
Yeah.
And they theorize that in the painting, the light is turning people to stone, and there is a man and a boy escaping the light into a cave away from a serpent.
Right. And Adam is like, gotta find out what this whole thing is. What's the light? Why are people standing around the light being turned to stone? Because they're standing in sort of a circle with interlinked hands as if this was all planned.
Right.
And Margaret's like, no big deal. Probably just binding their souls together. She just kind of drops this. I guess she's been reading some more Fringe books.
Fantastic. Well, the reason why I bring this up is because then 2 scenes later, Matthew's talking with his kid friends and is like, everyone's been turned to stone. And I'm like, Matthew, catch the heck up. Adam figured this out 3 scenes ago. He's already out at the stones trying to figure out if they're actually people. And you're like still on the first page of the book, dude.
Well, Dai gives them this. He doesn't give them the amulet. He shows them this amulet that he's like using to ward off evil or something. And it has like a little etching of a serpent. So they make their own, not mold.
Well,
but
so they're like, we're going to do, hang on, what's it called? A rubbing. So they're
Right.
going to like put a piece of paper over it. And then basically this, when you like rub with the pencil and it captures all the indentations. I used to do that in elementary school with like dimes and stuff. You put the dime under the paper and
Right.
you kind of run a pencil over it and you get like an impression of the dime. Except then in the next scene, we see what they made and it looks more like just a really crude,
Yeah.
terrible drawing than a rubbing.
Yeah. Yeah.
And they're like, it looks like a snake. And then I think it's Margaret is like, no, it's a serpent. And they're like, how can you tell? And she's like, serpents are bigger. And I'm like, but it's a medallion. There's like no set size scale here.
Well, we get some interesting like mythology here. So in the Christian mythology, the serpent is like thought of as evil and bad and stuff. But before that, in sort of the pagan religion that was here before, they were thought of as like what was it, like protectors or something? Something benevolent.
I didn't write it down.
Yeah, it was, and then, or like guardians of treasure, but like benevolent guardians or something. So they theorize that in the picture, the serpent is like guarding some sort of treasure. And they come up with this idea that the treasure it's guarding is knowledge. I forget why I think it's because like the serpent was around the church, or like there's an inscription of the serpent in the church, and there's another inscription in the church like about knowledge, and they're like the serpent's guarding knowledge or something. Because the church, we find out, was also built above a pagan worship site.
Yeah. There's also this other like sanctuary that Dai is talking about is like not quite in the circle. It's like outside the town, but inside the circle, or the other way around, like outside the circle, but inside the town or something. And like some sort of technicality like allows people to get there because like, you're not allowed to leave the circle or whatever. And I don't know.
Well, there is. I think the most important takeaway from all of this is that there's a stone carving or whatever in the church with like a bishop getting bitten by a snake, to remind people that like the pagan religion has never really gone away.
Right.
And that is, if you can't connect the dots, like that's what's haunting this town is,
I wrote down Dai ', but I forgot the apostrophe, and I realized that the way Dai's name is spelled, I think it's spelled D-A-I.
Yeah, it's D-A-I.
With an S becomes the word Daius. I don't know if that means anything. If that's related to like anything that happens later on, guess I'll see.
Well, there is a dais underneath the town supporting all the stones.
Well, that is actually very interesting.
Huh.
Dai's name becomes Deus if you add an S.
One other thing we see here is that Crabtree gets a letter, and she is contemplating whether to leave it on the table for presumably Adam, but then she decides to just hide it.
But then Adam gets a telegram. It's brought to him by this butler-looking fellow who I don't remember seeing before. Turns out he's not a butler. I think Adam assumes he's a butler as well because he's like, thanks, dude. And he's like, so that is pretty interesting. Turns out my telegram got out. I sent a telegram to Palomar and was like, what are these stones pointing at? And they were like, they're pointing at a supernova. Well, it's a black hole now, but it was pointing at a supernova.
Right. Going back just a little bit, one other thing we found out with the stones is that their magnetic field is out of whack. So normally you can date stones by their magnetic field because the Earth's magnetic field flip-flops every once in a while.
And part of the reason why we know that is because you can see the magnetic flips in stones that are old enough.
Yeah, but these stones should have a different magnetic field based on how old they seem to be.
Great. We do get that great scene of Adam just standing next to a rock in a rain jacket, holding a rod up to it, and then we hear just like, I guess, diegetic sound that's just static, which I guess is the sound of his magnetometer.
It's the psychic force of the stones, man. But yeah, Adam actually gets this telegram or whatever in the pub, and Hendrik is there in the pub again, and he sits down with Adam. And he's like, Adam realizes, like, hey, you're Hendrik, that famous, like, astronomer.
Not only famous, the guy who discovered this black hole that these stones are pointing at. And then we find out this guy discovered the black hole, gained a lot of notoriety, and then just quit, just left the university. And his justification for this was like, I thought if I came here, I could study the black hole more, but now I just don't care.
Well, he tells this story. He says that he heard this story about a village called Wheel Wicker, which was the ancient name for Milbury. And there was an account from like when the supernova happened of someone who like saw the supernova and like gained incredible knowledge or something like that. So because he heard this story, he decided to quit and just come to Milbury and find out like what the heck was going on.
And now he just like doesn't really care. He's just a happy person, basically.
But the weird thing here is that Adam is like, well, that guy was probably just like off his rocker. And Hendrik's response to this is like, hey, Adam, you little punk, like, don't say that. This guy was a visionary, okay? Just shut up. Don't say anything.
It's going to be Dai. Dai is going to be revealed to be that guy. He's the oldest person in town so far. But then the guy references that the supernova is in the constellation Ursa Major, which is the Great Bear.
Right.
And then he mentions like the bear cult is probably still active. And I'm like, I thought we were doing the serpent cult in this show. I thought we were serpents. Now we're bears. But then Adam and Matthew the next day attend a traditional
another satanic ritual,
pagan ritual of some sort going on in this town. And Adam's like, hey, that farmer guy, like he hated dancing like a week ago, and now he's out there having the time of his life. That's a little weird, don't you think? And Margaret's like,
And this is the epic cliffhanger that we end on. Is it the farmer?
No, yeah, the cliffhanger is what was the farmer's name?
I don't remember.
Whatever it was, the cliffhanger is literally like after Adam says all this, we see some shots of him dancing, and then Matthew goes, hey, look, it's, Greg or whatever his name is, and then it ends like on that line. Literally, he says, hey, look, it's I'm just going to use Greg. He goes, hey, look, it's Greg, and then smash cut to credits. What a thrilling conclusion.
Yeah, this is kind of what I meant when I said a lot of this series feels like a movie that's chopped up into 25-minute segments, because we get cliffhangers like this that seem to not be cliffhangers in any discernible way other than like them really trying to play up that this is the end of the episode and that this is amazing and something really revolutionary is happening.
Well, yeah, this cliffhanger is decidedly less exciting than the past two.
Yeah, it's pretty lame.
But mostly because not much happened in the episode, so there wasn't really any way for them to take the cliffhanger.
No, yeah, this is definitely the weakest episode so far. So much of this is just people contemplating on what they learned and saw last week. And the new stuff is interesting, I think. Like the stuff with the pagan rituals and the pagan snake symbol.
Serpent stuff, yeah.
But just like 15 minutes of this probably is just essentially recap of the last episode. So that kind of
Or
sucks.
the first episode, or recap of the first episode. Like the school scenes are all very much recap. Split into two groups. One of them is the happy group. One of them is the sad group. To get into the happy group, you got to be smart. Like we learned all that in the first episode. So getting it again here where one of the four goes into the happy group, like I think that's interesting. But then the way they do it is they like basically explain the entire situation to you again. And it's like, well, we already know that. And especially in a 25-minute episode, that feels more so like padding than in like a 45-minute episode. If they did that, it may be more acceptable.
Sure, that makes sense, yeah. I don't know if you had any sort of interesting topics you wanted to touch on here at the end, because I had one.
I was just going to briefly talk about the astrophysics guy, but you can go first.
Yeah, so in this, one interesting thing we learned in this is that the black hole was in the constellation Ursa Major, the Great Bear. And I just want to mention some etymology type stuff. This is a lot of what's going on in this story is like pagan, so ancient. And since this is Britain, that's obviously like a Germanic thing. So one thing that is interesting about like the Germanic languages is that the word berserk actually comes from bear. So the bear part of that is bear, and the cirque part of it is skin, which references this like ancient tradition of like Viking dudes putting bear skins on and taking psychedelic drugs and just wreaking havoc on people's villages and stuff. So the bear, like etymologically, historically, in these sort of northern languages, is always related to like people being out of their minds or going crazy or being under the influence of either drugs or like some sort of psychic extra human force or something like that.
Mm-hmm.
So interesting that they would put this in the constellation of the Great Bear.
Well, I think this black hole has a lot to say about like the themes of this series with the whole bear thing. And then what I was going to talk about was just like Adam's conversation with, what was this guy's name? Hendrik. Adam says something like, well, you can't see it. And Hendrik says like, yes, but you know it's there. And that's the interesting part about it, is that you know it's there but you can't see it.
Right.
And then, like, to me, just seems to be, like, for this whole thing is, like, something's going on in this town, but, like, you can't see it. Like, Adam, he sees the painting and he comes to the town, he knows something's going on in the town, but he can't see what it is yet. But what's keeping him there is the fact that he knows something is going on with the stones. Same thing with Matthew, is, like, he can't see what Dai's doing. He doesn't understand what Dai's doing, but he knows Dai has got information that he wants, and that alone is keeping him invested in Dai.
Right. And that's interesting that you bring that up. I want to touch on what you're kind of saying here when we get to the end of the show, because I think it's actually really surprising. Surprisingly, because you haven't watched the ending, like actually really relevant to what happens.
Well, I mean, it's something that I picked up on because I do astrophysics. I don't know if I've ever like explicitly said that on the podcast. I know I've said I'm a physicist, but I do astrophysics, so this is like my field. Just as like a fun aside, if you didn't know, there was actually the very first picture of a black hole was released recently.
Yeah, even I heard about this.
And it's interesting because it's not actually a picture of the black hole itself. It's a picture of, light and gas that's falling into the black hole that we can see, because black holes' light cannot escape a black hole, and we need light to be able to see things. There was the one other thing about this conversation that I wanted to touch on was, I think it was Hendrik, he says something, or maybe it was Adam, saying something like, oh, a black hole is like infinitely radiating energy or something, which is like kind of not really true in like a straightforward sense, because black holes absorb energy, things fall into black holes, but it's interesting because there is actually a process by which black holes can radiate energy, but it's not the black hole itself radiating energy. So, and now I don't remember if Stephen Hawking had come up with this theory of Hawking radiation before this or not, but if he hadn't, I think this is like a surprisingly prescient observation, I guess. But I think the black hole holds a lot of relevance to the series because the whole radiating energy thing, again, ties into the circle of stones radiating psychic energy, almost serving like, in this kind of metaphor, as like a black hole of psychic energy here on Earth, whereas a black hole in space is for physical energy, things like matter and light.
Yeah, definitely. You're definitely touching on things that this show is going to be going for in the next couple of episodes. And also, I also just want to say that this scene explains all of this for kids, right? Because this is a kids show, as creepy as it's going to get, because we haven't even seen how creepy it gets yet. But it is a kids show, so they are explaining all this for kids and stuff.
Yeah, I think it's interesting. I am actually really enjoying this because I feel like these, scientific concepts are things that I understand on a very high level, but it's fun to see them presented in this in this medium where it's presented to kids and the general public in a way where it also fits into the plot. I don't know. It's super fascinating to me.
Well, they're marrying that with ancient pagan rituals and mythology and stuff like that. And that's just going to keep getting more intertwined as the series goes on.
And I think that's super cool, in my opinion. So.
Yeah. So, as we keep mentioning, all the cast members have been introduced. Mm-hmm. But we wanted to touch on some of the crew members as well. So I did a little homework on a couple of them, just ones that stood out in the credits. So we have Adrian Brenard, who's the film editor. And according to IMDb, he's edited, quite a few shows, mostly miniseries and TV movies. Nothing that really stood out, nothing that I really knew of beforehand, but, he has quite a few under his belt. And then we have Sidney Sager, who is the composer for this, he's composed quite a few shows as well, and he was actually the head of music at HTV for 30 years or something.
Wow.
Or 20 or 30. It was I forget, I didn't write down the exact dates. Mm-hmm. I think it was 20.
That's fine.
Yeah.
20 years.
It was the 70s to the 90s or something. I don't know.
You can always put the exact dates in the show notes.
Yeah. And I remember, right, he was born in 1917 and died in 2002. Don't know how I remembered that.
Wow.
But, yeah.
He lived a pretty long life.
Yeah. And
1976 to 1992. That's what you've got in the in the document.
Little less than 20 years. And I wanted to introduce another segment here.
Oh boy, here we go.
Because I noticed while watching this episode that the characters are wearing the most 70s costumes available or conceivable. So I wanted to introduce a new segment called, what weird and wacky 70s outfits are we shown this week?
Well, I'd like to nominate Adam's raincoat outfit, which is like the most 70s raincoat ever. Because it's just overblown, it's massive, and it's not even either pure black or gray. It's this weird off black, blue, gray that's those like very popular in the 70s and 80s. Not even raining. What's going on, Adam? What's going on?
Well, I want to retroactively do this segment as well, because in the first episode we're introduced to Adam's massive sideburns.
I remember that. Sideburns were in back then, though. So.
Yeah, exactly, which is why they're a weird, wacky 70s costume. And in episode 2, we're introduced to Matthew's bright yellow bathrobe.
Ah, yes, I remember that.
Which isn't necessarily like a 70s thing, but it's just like a thing. So in this episode, we get some very 70s children's outfits with, Matthew wearing like the too small for him shirt and the bell-bottom pants, and the other kid is wearing the same thing, and Sandra actually is wearing the same thing as well. Mm-hmm. So very 70s outfits there.
Right. I don't really remember the outfits beyond this episode very well, but in the future, I'm going to keep an eye out now so I can nominate them for this segment.
And I actually had one quote this week. Oh, well, actually, it's the one you already mentioned from Hendrik. Well, that's what's so intriguing, don't you think? To know it's there and yet not be able to see it. Huh. Didn't know it was that one. Well, that was underwhelming.
Much like the whole episode.
Yeah.
Fitting. Well, I don't have anything else to say.
Yeah, neither do I.
You can email us at thedoctor@decadvegetable.com. Questions, comments, concerns, angry rants, love letters, your thoughts on the Serpent cult. You can find us on YouTube at Decorative Vegetable. You can find us on Apple Podcasts, Google Play, and Spotify. All that inevitable, a classic sci-fi podcast. Be sure to leave a rating if you like the show.
Check us on Facebook, Trust Your Doctor. Like us on Facebook. Also check us on Twitter at TYD Podcast and follow us on Twitter. And next week we'll be narrowing down this mystery with Narrowing the Circle. But until then, the end.